Let's be honest, Zack Snyder's 300 wasn't just a movie, it was a cultural phenomenon. But here's the thing. While it's a killer way to spend 2 hours, using 300 as your history textbook is like using a comic book to study quantum physics. The film is based on Frank Miller's graphic novel, not directly on the dusty scrolls of Herodotus. And while that gives it its unique, brutalist charm, it also means it's packed with inaccuracies. Today we're going to separate the myth from the historical record, the six-packs from the actual armor, and the monsters from the men. Because the real story of the Battle of Thermopylae is far more complex, strategic, and in many ways more fascinating than the Hollywood version.
This is where we hold them! This is where we fight! This is where they die! On these shields, boys!
Nuck 1. The army of 7,000? The first and biggest fib the movie tells you is right there in the title. The film shows King Leonidas defiantly marching out of Sparta with his personal guard of 300 warriors, later joined by a small band of Arcadians. It creates this incredible image of a tiny, elite force against a sea of enemies. The reality? The Greek army was much, much bigger. Historians, primarily drawing from the ancient writer Herodotus, estimate the total Greek force was closer to 7,000 soldiers. That included 300 Spartan hoplites, yes, but also thousands of others from across Greece. 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, 1,000 Phocians, and several thousand more from other Peloponnesian city-states. This wasn't just a Spartan suicide mission. It was a coalition of Greek states mounting a desperate defense. So why did Leonidas only bring 300 of his own men? Politics and religion. The expedition coincided with the sacred festival of Carneia, a hugely important religious event during which warfare was forbidden for Spartans. But with the Persians advancing, they couldn't afford to do nothing. So they found a loophole. The kings were allowed to march with their 300-man royal bodyguard, the Hippias. The plan was for Leonidas to hold the pass until the festival ended, when the full Spartan army would march out to reinforce him. As we know, they didn't make it in time. And there's another group the movie conveniently forgets, the helots. The helots were the enslaved population of Sparta, a people they had conquered and brutally oppressed. Each Spartan hoplite was typically accompanied by at least one, and sometimes more, lightly armed helots who served as skirmishers and aides. That means there were likely another 900 or more helots at the pass, fighting alongside the men who enslaved them. It kind of complicates the whole fighting for freedom narrative, doesn't it?
Madman. You're a madman.
Air and water. But you'll find plenty of both down there.
Number 2, the Spartan six-pack uniform. Okay, let's talk about the look. The movie gives us warriors clad in little more than leather briefs, flowing red capes, and helmets. It's a look that emphasizes their perfect, chiseled physiques, and Frank Miller, the comics creator, openly admitted he did it because it looked cooler and helped distinguish the characters. Fair enough for art, but terrible for battle. A real Spartan hoplite was a walking tank. Their primary defense was a complete suit of armor called the panoply. This suit included a bronze helmet, often in the iconic Corinthian style that covered the entire head, and a bronze chest plate, or cuirass, which was frequently molded to look like a muscular torso, so they had abs, just made of metal. To protect their lower legs, they wore bronze greaves, but most importantly, they carried the aspis. This was a large round shield made of wood and covered in a thin layer of bronze, their most crucial piece of defensive equipment. Marching into battle half-naked would have been absolute suicide. Their armor was their life, and their primary weapon wasn't a short sword for dramatic duels, but a 9-foot spear called a doru. The sword, or xiphos, was a secondary last resort weapon. The fighting style was also completely different. The movie shows Spartans breaking formation to engage in chaotic individual duels. In reality, a Spartan's strength was the phalanx, a tight, disciplined formation where their shields interlocked to create a wall, with a forest of spears bristling from behind it. It was a meat grinder. Breaking formation was the worst thing a soldier could do, as it created a weak point for the enemy to exploit. Unity and discipline, not individual heroism, were the keys to their success. Three, the God King and his army of freaks. The film's portrayal of King Xerxes and the Persian Empire is perhaps its most outlandish departure from reality. Xerxes is shown as a 9-foot-tall, androgynous god king, draped in chains and piercings, leading a grotesque army of mutants, ninjas, and even a giant armored rhinoceros. The real Xerxes was, well, a man. Historical sources describe him as being of normal height, with a traditional beard, and a skilled politician and administrator who presided over the massive, multicultural Achaemenid Empire. He was a cautious commander who planned his invasion of Greece meticulously. The film turns him into a cartoon villain, erasing the sophistication of Persian culture, which at the time was a flourishing center of art, science, and architecture. And that army, the Persian military, was one of the most formidable forces of the ancient world, comprised of professional soldiers from across the empire, including their legendary heavy infantry unit, the Immortals. They relied heavily on skilled cavalry and archers. What they didn't have, at least not at Thermopylae, were war elephants or battle rhinos. That was pure Hollywood fantasy, designed to make the Persians seem monstrous and alien. Issue 4, Sparta, the Noble Utopia. 300 presents Sparta as the ultimate bastion of freedom, discipline, and virtue, defending the free world against Persian tyranny. This is a romanticized image that conveniently ignores the brutal reality of Spartan society. Sparta was a totalitarian, militaristic state built on the backs of a slave class. The helots, who made up the vast majority of the population, had no rights and lived in constant fear. To keep them terrorized and subjugated, the Spartans created the Krypteia, a kind of secret police. As a rite of passage, young Spartan men were sent into the countryside to hide by day and at night murder any helot they found, simply to instill fear and prove their manhood. This brings us to one of the most famous myths associated with Sparta, which the film dramatically portrays in its opening scene: the practice of abandoning weak or deformed infants on a mountainside to die. This story comes almost entirely from one source, the writer Plutarch, who was writing over 500 years after the Battle of Thermopylae. For centuries, it was taken as fact. However, modern archaeology tells a different story. Anthropologists from Athens Medical School examined the bone deposits found at the supposed site on Mount Taygetus. They found no infant remains. Zero. What they did find were the remains of adult men, aged 18 to 35, dating to the era of the Persian Wars. The conclusion? The chasm was likely a place of execution for criminals, traitors, and prisoners of war, not a dumping ground for babies. The myth of Spartan infanticide was likely just that, a myth, perhaps propaganda, popularized centuries later.
The boy was born. If he'd been small or puny, or sickly or misshapen, he would have been discarded.
5. The battle fought in a vacuum. Finally, the film presents the Battle of Thermopylae as the only thing happening, the glorious last stand of 300 men as the single deciding factor. It completely ignores the other half of the Greek strategy, the navy. At the exact same time Leonidas was holding the hot gates on land, the allied Greek navy, led by the Athenian general Themistocles, was fighting the Persian fleet at the Straits of Artemisium. This was a crucial, coordinated two-front defense. The plan was for the army to block the narrow pass at Thermopylae, forcing a bottleneck, while the navy blocked the narrow strait at Artemisium, preventing the Persian fleet from sailing down the coast to outflank and supply their army. For 3 days, the much smaller Greek navy held its own against the massive Persian fleet, fighting them to a standstill. It was only after they received news that Leonidas and his men had been defeated and the pass was lost that the Greek fleet strategically withdrew to fight another day. A fight that would culminate in the decisive Greek naval victory at Salamis. The movie's omission of Artemisium completely erases the strategic brilliance of the Greek plan and the vital role played by the Athenians and their allies at sea. So does knowing all this make the movie 300 any less awesome? Not at all. It's still a visually stunning, wildly entertaining piece of cinema. But it's not a documentary. It's a mythological retelling, a legend painted with a cinematic brush. The real history, stripped of the fantasy, is arguably more compelling. It's a story of complex strategy, of a coalition of states standing together, of political maneuvering, and of a society that was both admirable in its discipline and terrifying in its brutality. The real Spartans weren't comic book superheroes. They were hardened soldiers from a deeply flawed but formidable culture. The truth isn't always as clean-cut as Hollywood would have us believe. The heroes are more complicated, the villains are more human, and the strategy is far more intelligent. And that, I think, is a story worth telling. What do you think? Which historical inaccuracy in 300 surprised you the most? And what historical movie should we deconstruct next? Let us know down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into history, do us a favor and hit that like button. Share with a friend and subscribe for more stories from behind the curtain of wealth, power, and history. Thanks for watching.
Passerby, that here, by Spartan law, we lie.